Hello, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Thumbs up. Yes, no funky echoes or anything weird going on. Yay, seeing shaking of heads, that's good. We had a few dramas with that 2 weeks ago, so pleased to hear we are getting it all up and running. We are learning. It's technology. We iterate and improve. It's what we're all about. Well, welcome to Canterbury Tech's online social event. Our idea with this was we got such phenomenal feedback and such awesome attendance from our last meeting 2 weeks ago that we thought, look, we're all in isolation. We're all stuck in our own bubbles. We're all growing beards. Nice effort there, Vaughan. So we might, yeah, Brent, yeah, we can't beat you. So we might do a social thing. And we had a couple of people that have come back from overseas with fantastic stories. So we thought we'd have a chat to them. And as well as that, we'll break out and have a bit of a social hang with different people in breakout rooms. So a quick run through the protocol for this evening. Your mics are going to be off by default, as you've probably already worked out. You can choose to have your video on or off, although obviously when we drop you into breakout rooms, it'd probably be nice to have your video on so people can see your facial expressions. And we are planning to drop you all into breakout rooms 3 times, Neil, or 2? I thought it was 2, but maybe it's 3, for some informal networking in small groups. Please don't dominate the conversation. Everyone gets a go. No sexism, innuendo, bad language, or slurs of any kind. In other words, please be nice. If anyone has any concerns about conduct, please note the name and privately message Brent, Neil, or myself. I'm Andy, in case you didn't already know that. And we'll consider removing them from the chat. Ask questions via the chat. We might pose 1 or 2, depending on how we go for time. Brent will be monitoring the chat feed. I don't think Guy has logged on yet, Neil. So, yep. So we're going to kick off with Helen Shorthouse. Helen is, as we all well know, been a stalwart of the tech community here in Christchurch. She was working for
Christchurch NZ.
I was trying to think what it was called before that, Helen.
Oh, CDC.
CDC, yes. And then I was getting disease things in my head and getting confused. So Helen has been at Christchurch NZ and its predecessor for several years, has been a real advocate of our tech community. And 18 months ago, Helen, you wrapped up and headed off overseas.
It was 14, but yeah, end of 2018. And I'd just like to point out before I start, I haven't grown a beard.
We're pleased to see that. So you headed off with the idea of spending a couple of years going overseas and doing the OE. Was that the thinking? Yeah,
the original thinking was a year travel and maybe 2 years do voluntary service overseas. Which
and
all
how
kind
did
of
that go?
Quite badly, actually.
So
things don't go to plan. So I basically, before we get on to the running away from coronavirus, spent 6 months in India and a week or so in Bhutan. But then unfortunately my dad got ill and eventually died. So I went back to the UK, which meant I was then had an extended period of time in the UK, didn't stick to my travel plan, and essentially was trying to do my trip in reverse. So unfinished business still to be done, I think.
But you made it to Europe, and where were you in January when everything started blowing up globally?
I think it has to be said, I'm just taking the picture off because it made me look like I'd got a building in my teeth. I was actually in mid-February, we were when it was really kicking off. I was just coming back from a ski trip in France. We were traveling around Europe in a camper van, but we'd actually left it in northern Italy to travel over the Alps. We traveled back from the Alps to Turin, picked up the camper van. Coronavirus was something that was happening way away in China. and then we kind of traveled, and during that day we were traveling over to Venice to see a friend. But during that day, Italy had one town that had got some cases and they went into lockdown, and we kind of passed it on the motorway and didn't think anything of it, and then camped on the way, just in a lay-by somewhere, and then woke up the next morning to realize that actually they put another 11 cities down into lockdown in the north of Italy, and we were about 15 kilometers away from the nearest one, and we traveled across the top of Lombardy, which was essentially where we were where they were shutting everything down. But really, to be honest with you, at that stage wasn't really taking too much notice of it, and went to Venice to meet a friend. And on the way to Venice, there was an announcement that the Venice Carnival had been cancelled as well, so that was more of a downer than anything. It was just an inconvenience. And we met our friend at the airport, and I was quite surprised to see a number of people walking around with masks on, and he'd actually been heat scanned as he'd come through, and had been given a leaflet about what to do if he had coronavirus. But apart from that, Venice was nice and quiet. There was lots of people walking around in their kind of carnival outfits, so it was quite fun. But apart from that, we really didn't take too much notice of it for the first couple of days, and then it was kind of coming through in the media a bit in Italy, and I think by the third day, when we'd realised there was only 2 of us in the campsite, when they said they were normally about 100, and that things were quite quiet, that kind of this thing was hitting Italy quite badly. So we knew we needed to get out of Italy, and then Chris and I were just I was with my husband Chris, and we were just discussing where to go next. Our original plan was to go to Slovenia, but we were a bit worried if we went down into Slovenia we'd get kind of stuck in Europe, because we didn't want to get locked down. And to be honest with you, that was the main thing. There was no talk of social distancing, staying indoors or anything like that. We just didn't want to have our holiday ruined, to be frank. So eventually we decided to go to Slovenia, and we did do a stock up in Lidl of dried food, and that was a bit of an odd experience, but didn't really bother us. I think it was a couple of weeks after, or a little while after, we'd noticed on the media that a lot of the supermarkets in the lockdown towns were getting wiped out, but there was no evidence of that. We went and got some dried food and rice and pasta and everything, but other than that, no problems. So we dropped our friend off at the airport in Venice at the end of that trip, and then we basically drove pretty quickly to get out of Italy, because that was pretty obvious that Italy was where it was at, and we didn't want to be part of it, and wanted to carry on our travels. So that kind of felt normal. And then we drove over the border, which felt really weird, because I did feel like we were running away from something, and we drove over the border in Slovenia, and there was absolutely nothing there. It was all happening back in Italy, but it hadn't really, nobody else with Europe, with the open borders, it was all free and easy travel. So we basically then spent the next week or so on holiday without thinking about it too much.
But it quickly came up behind you, didn't it?
Yeah. So it's amazing, I have to say, looking back, it is quite incredible how quickly, and I guess everybody's been through this now, but how quickly things changed, from something that seemed so distant in China and then hit Italy. And at that stage, I was really still thinking it wasn't going to affect me if I could just keep moving. And then how quickly, if I look back at some of the videos we were making and pictures we were taking and the things I wrote in my diary, it was very much kind of how your thinking changes, and even down to, I feel fine, I've obviously not got it. And, as long as I don't get locked down, I'll be all right. I don't want to get locked down, but I wasn't really thinking about catching a horrible virus or anything like that. So, yeah, sorry.
So at what point did you suddenly go, oh, heck, this is a lot more serious than we thought. It's time to head back to home, back to New Zealand. Where did that fit in?
Probably about another couple of weeks, to be honest with you. We travelled through Slovenia for a week or so, and then we went into Croatia, and I think we got to Croatia just at the beginning of March, and about the same time, obviously tourism started to slow down in bits of Europe, and even the Croatian tourism minister realized while we were there that there was not many tourists coming, and he announced a big kind of push to get domestic tourists traveling around, did a big kind of promotion, which in hindsight seems like a really daft idea to say travel around the country and get 50% discount and everything, but that was what he did at the time. But then pretty quickly, Italy essentially put the whole of the north of Lombardy, the northern region, into lockdown. And that basically freaked all the Italians in the north of Italy out. And they then moved everywhere to go and see their family and friends in southern Italy, and thus spread coronavirus all over the place. Shortly afterwards, I think Slovenia shut their border with Italy, and then pretty quickly Croatia announced that new arrivals had to go into 14 days of self-isolation. So while we've been traveling around and kind of been keeping an eye on the media, and things had seemed to still be in Italy and China, all of a sudden it seemed really, really fast. Within a couple of days, other countries started getting cases, and some were closing borders. And again, we were sort of only really concerned about getting locked down. And one of our concerns was in Croatia, it's illegal to freedom camp. And actually, because we were there in March, none of the campsites were actually open. So we were freedom camping. But it wasn't that easy. So we thought, well, it's going to be stink if we get locked down in a camper van. We'd better go back to Slovenia, whereas at least it's easy. And so essentially, at the kind of, I don't know, about the 11th or 12th of March, we were back in Slovenia, convinced we were going to stay in Slovenia, and again, this is where your brain kind of is a bit slow to react. We just thought we'd be able to ride it out for a month. We'd got enough food for a month, and we'd stay put. And we kept having conversations that were going round and round. And one morning we woke up and just said, no, that's it. We've made a decision. We're staying. So we did our emergency purchases of some toilet paper, some food, and a pair of trainers, so we could at least go out running. And then essentially that day we'd gone round to a couple of supermarkets, and all the dried food and the toilet rolls that everybody else talks about and pasta is all available, but the fresh food had kind of been obliterated from the supermarket. So we'd gone to about 4 different supermarkets, and then hadn't found anything. But when we went into town, the town we were staying the next day, there was a wee farmers market. So we went there, and they'd actually got some onions and vegetables and things. So I tried to buy something, and I still to this day have no idea what went on, but I tried to buy some onions and some lemons, and the stall holder basically flipped and pulled the stuff out of my bag and turned his back on me and refused to serve me. And
Wow.
I have no idea what that was about. I don't know whether he thought I was foreign and didn't want to serve me. I have no idea. I mean, we even asked a couple of people and they didn't know what it was. So I don't know, but it really switched Chris and I to thinking, shit, we're in this country, we don't speak the language, we don't have any network or anything, we don't know anybody. If we can't get food and people are going to be aggro,
yeah, time to
be
go.
really difficult. So and then we went for a coffee to a place where we'd kind of adopted as our local coffee house, and the lady said, I'm not serving coffee because of coronavirus, and I'm going to be shut next week because the kids are going to be stayed back from school because the schools are closing.
Yeah.
And
so it all comes kind of pouring down on top of you, and you go,
yeah,
it's time
exactly.
to get
and
off.
The emotions were quite high. So we and the Slovenia had actually got a new government that was being formed, and we were just a bit worried that it was the weekend, and by Monday they were going to shut the border. So we essentially really quickly, it was 4:00 in the afternoon, we basically went, nah, that's it. So we talked about going, we come from the UK originally, so we talked about staying in Slovenia as an option, which originally we thought was the easy option. Going back to the UK, which we didn't really fancy, it's not that exciting in the UK and it's flipping expensive. Or coming back to New Zealand, which, to be honest with you, seemed to be although it's our home, it seemed to be the hardest option because we didn't have a job. Our house is rented out. We'd sold our car and all that kind of thing. So if we came back, that was going to open up new challenges for us. But in the end, we decided that was what we were going to do. And so we also were watching what was going on. So it started spreading in Spain and France, and we were watching camper van people that we were hooked up on social media with in Spain saying how they were told they can't stay at campsites, the beaches were shut, everybody was told to stay inside, the army was going down the streets announcing don't go out. Supermarkets have been kind of basically, bought out of all existence, and so it just sounded terrible. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, we started driving, and we drove for the rest of that day and then all through the next day. So covered about 1,600 kilometers through Austria, Germany, France, and Belgium and France to get back to the ferry port. And as we were driving through Germany, we were going to go into France, and we'd got friends who were texting us saying, don't go that way because the French have started, blockades and, really checking people coming through. And as we were going through Germany, the German government announced that they were closing the borders of Germany the next day. So we were really, honestly,
started screaming,
like we were just like, get me to the border, get me to the ferry port. So we got to the ferry port and essentially collapsed in a heap over in the UK. And originally, when we talked about going up, we thought, well, we'll maybe spend a couple of weeks in the UK, say goodbye to our families, sell the camper van, come back to New Zealand. And that was as we were driving up through Germany. And essentially, by the time we got to the UK, even that became clear that that was a crazy idea. Chris's parents had gone into self-isolation, so we weren't going to see them. We were even checking to see whether I should go and see my mum because she's over 70. But we did go and stay with her. And then we had to deal with the camper. And I think at that time, Jacinda Ardern then announced calling citizens home. Which felt...
So that really puts the motivation underneath you to go, okay, we've really got to get a move on here.
Yeah.
Time to jump on one of those last flights out.
Yeah. So this was the Monday, and Air New Zealand announced that their last flight out of the UK was the Saturday. And we still had to sell our camper van and find somewhere to stay when we got back and get a flight. So we did that. That was a fairly full-on stressful week. We had a friend who was going to buy the camper van, but he was in Ireland. They just went into lockdown, so he couldn't get over. Long and short of it, it was either the scrap man or I managed to sell it to somebody locally for a very, very cheap price. But I was crying at the thought of this lovely camper van going to the scrap. So we basically then had to get a flight, and of course lots of countries had started saying you couldn't even transit through our country. So that was pretty complicated, but I got onto Air New Zealand, and we eventually transited through Singapore on the Thursday. So then we had to find somewhere to live, so I put a call out on Facebook, and luckily lots of people responded with suggestions. But I've got a friend here, and so we're staying in Lansdowne, which is out on the old Taitat Road, in a lovely old lifestyle block, and then an Airbnb. So that's where we are at the moment, which is awesome, and lots of space around.
And
us.
now having to try and re-establish a life in Christchurch. You're
so essentially now having come
what it is you can do or you want to do.
Yeah, so come back into the thick of it, and now looking for a job. So call out to anybody if you need any marketing support, content writing, even on an ad hoc basis or as a permanent contract. That would be awesome. But I feel like I've got some skills. I love the tech ecosystem, so that's where I feel my home is, and so I want to get back in and involved in it. So I'll flick my contact details in the chat if anybody wants to get in contact, or they can contact me via LinkedIn.
Fantastic. What an adventure and quite the story. It almost feels, it's like, almost a war that we're fighting against this virus, with borders being closed, barriers going up, the army patrolling. And I'm sure, Guy's got some bits that he's going to be telling us about his escape from the States very shortly when we have a chat to him. But before we do that, thanks for your time, Helen. Appreciate that.
No worries.
And now let's jump into a networking session. So we're going to use the Zoom breakout room function and chuck you all into virtual rooms for 6 minutes of conversation with a few, hopefully not too random strangers. You probably know. see a 60-second countdown, and then you'll be returned back here, the main room, where we'll have a chat to Guy Horrocks, which we're really looking forward to. So, Neil, let's go break out. Maybe. If Neil can work the buttons. What's happening, Neil? Oh, there we go. Invited. Yes, there we go. All right. Welcome back. Hopefully you all enjoyed that. Nice. I've got the poll up on screen, the post breakout room poll, and 93% of us are currently saying great fun. That's exactly what we wanted to hear. And that's the whole reason why we wanted to give this a crack, to see how we can get it all going. So so that's really good. I like that. Now, we're delighted to be joined by another gentleman who has made his way back to New Zealand just recently. Guy is the co-founder of Solve. He's a Canterbury boy, a Christchurch native, but has been based in New York for the last 5 to 6 years, until a few weeks ago when he and his wife decided to return to New Zealand. Guy, welcome to Canterbury Tech.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's cool to meet a lot of new faces here, and a few old ones as well.
So you've been involved with the Student Volunteer Army back in the day, working with Sam on a number of their initiatives before you headed off to the States.
Yeah, I actually knew Sam, but I actually wasn't involved in the early stuff. He did such a good job, basically pulling out 10,000 students to dig mud and people out of all the sort of chaos post-earthquake. And I suppose it was just when I came back about five weeks ago from New York, it sort of seemed like there was going to be a new need for people helping. And so I sort of reached out to him and chatted. And then as we started discussing it, we started realizing that in actual fact, there was kind of a technology solution to this that could help scale it. Because instead of sending 1,000 people and breaking them up into teams of 50 in New Brighton and digging along the road, this was like a sort of one-to-one kind of double-sided marketplace. So very similar to a lot of the things you see in New York, like DoorDash and these things where you have delivery apps. You've got one side of the marketplace requesting, help with their pharmacy prescriptions and groceries, elderly people who probably shouldn't be going to the supermarket if they've got underlying health conditions and they need it safely. And then the other side, you've got the volunteers. So we basically just sort of figured out a software solution for that so it could scale easily. And that was the original idea. And then you start realizing all the complexities of all the use cases and you're like, oh shit, we have to build all these different things. But
it's pretty standard for software development though, Guy.
Yeah, it's just like that full-on feature creep and scope creep. But yeah, it's cool. Like we built basically just high-level tech stack. It's not like the prettiest because you weren't sure if we're building it for 1 month or 6 months, and now I think it's going to live a little longer, so we might rebuild part of it. But we've got just Google Forms that lead into a Google spreadsheet, then a Zapier integration that hooks that data into Pipedrive, which is just like a basic version of Salesforce, but it's cheaper. And then we have an AWS call center we spun up. And so elderly people can ring up if they're not good at computers, and they can log calls and say, hey, I want to buy the supermarket shopping, but I need someone to go help me. And then that hooks in, we actually just spun up our Solve database in the background. So all the data sort of feeds into that, Google Analytics, stuff they're doing on Facebook, all these different things, Survey Monkey polls, all that into one kind of database that we can then start analyzing, like time from first request through to delivery, different things around the data as well. So yeah, it's been interesting.
Yeah, and to going from initial concept through to delivering people using the system in a very, very short space of time.
Yeah,
that's some rapid product development.
Yeah, I actually forgot to mention as well. So we built a custom Shopify store for the supermarket, and then we hook it into Foodstuffs API. And then we luckily got an hour where we can send a chief picker at each of these stores to go in when the supermarket's closed, and they just pick groceries for the elderly and like medical staff and vulnerable. So it's very cool what we've been able to achieve, both technology-wise, but also these partnerships with people like Hyundai and New World, where they've sort of come to the party and sort of helped us a bit. But yeah, the Shopify store, I think we came up with the idea and 7 days later we launched it, which was pretty nuts.
Wow.
And we were a little worried about how it was going to scale, not just from a software perspective, but more so from like a people perspective, because you got to interview people when they come in as a volunteer, criminal record, driver's license, make sure they're like legit. And then you have to train them and give them PPE, because like the last thing we can have is like a volunteer turn up to an elderly person's house, and then if they're not wearing a mask and gloves, if they infect that person, it's obviously like game over. Like that's like the worst case scenario. So you sort of have to go through pretty good scaling of processes as much as scaling of technology.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, let's take the story back a little bit, Guy. So you head off to New York with the intention of taking over the world. You create Solve. At what point do you suddenly go, okay, we've got things really humming here, but I need to get back to New Zealand? What was the thinking there?
Yeah, so I've had a couple of software startups and a sort of hardware software startup originally. So I had a couple of mobile startups. One was called Polar Bear Farm, which built the first apps on the jailbreak market in 2007. And then we had Carnival Labs, which was like a mobile agency. So we'd build custom apps. And actually the earthquake was like the first sort of instigator of me moving. We basically pitched TVNZ and a bunch of people locally. And at this stage, we'd built a lot of apps because we'd been sort of early to the game. So we'd built apps for like HBO and Taco Bell and like lots of big brands. And we pitched TVNZ and they were like, we're not going to work with a small bunch of like people in their mid-20s. We're going to go work with a big advertising agency to build TVNZ on demand. And we were kind of gutted because we couldn't win any clients in New Zealand. And so after the earthquake hit, it destroyed our office and we just hired 5 staff. And luckily, the year or two before that had been quite profitable. So Cody and I had taken money out of the company and then we ended up putting it back in to pay for payroll for about 4 or 5 months. So it was pretty touch and go for a while. We were definitely like very worried. And at the same time, 80% of our revenue came through a mobile agency called the Hyper Factory. And that was based in New Zealand and New York. And when they sold, they moved all the development to India. So overnight, we'd gone from 3 to 8 staff. We'd lost the office and like lost all our revenue. So it was pretty dire. We gave it about, I think, a month or 2 in New Zealand trying to pitch, and we realized the market were a bit early. People weren't paying for it. And so then we flew out to the States, and then luckily from an intro from Rod Carr at Canterbury University to Craig Neville Manning at Google to Mark Darcy, who's at Facebook but used to be at Time Warner, Mark gave me an intro to all the people at Time Warner the day before he quit to join Facebook. So like he just rolled out the Rolodex, and suddenly we signed, our first big client was signing CNN and Time Magazine to run all their polling software for the 2012 elections. So that was like our first big break. And then a software company in Wellington, Pickpock, gaming company that's awesome. My friend Joss Ruffle was there, who now runs Garage Project in Wellington, the beer company. And they'd done some games for DreamWorks and then hooked us up with DreamWorks. And then we became the mobile partner of DreamWorks. So it kind of spiraled. And then, basically we had a really bad year. And then the next year, suddenly like we'd tripled our revenue, we'd doubled our staff count, and we were working with like Oreo and Coca-Cola and lots of big brands. So it was like, that was kind of the journey to get there. And then from that, we built a SaaS company that was like a mobile CRM, which we sold in 2016. And then we've just started this new company. And I think the big driver of coming back was I actually was in New Zealand a month and a half ago.
Oh, wow.
Flew to New York. We basically had a month and a half, like showing our baby off to, the Lion King, holding the baby up to all the family around the country. And then we arrived and we were back in New York, I think for 9 days, and decided to pack up and leave and come back to New Zealand. So
was it something about the environment when you got back and contrasting it to what you were seeing while you were here, or what was it that sort of was the main driver?
Yeah, the main driver I think was just we saw like the chaos coming, like all the we're a data company, so it's like leading indicators. It's like so obvious what was going to happen in New York, and the tough thing with coronavirus is like everything's like lagging indicators. So you sort of have like, people might get sick or be asymptomatic through the first 2-week period. Then they might get sick. Then it might take a couple of days before they go and get a test. Then it might a couple of days before they get the result back. Then if it's bad, they go to hospital. Then worst case scenario, they go into ICU and die. Like that's the horrible scenario. But like that whole period in some scenarios can take like a month. And so when you see like leading indicators and people are like, oh, no one's died yet in New York, we were sort of seeing the snowball effect and seeing the RO of like, you know, people infecting 2 to 3 people, which now they're saying could be 5 to 6 in bad scenarios. You know, like it was just looking bad. And then I'd organize, because we were launching this new product, and how I sort of run sales is like, I don't really like selling. I like just building community. If people want to buy the product, it's awesome. And there's a need, you try and help solve problems, but I'm not like a traditional salesperson when I've run my companies. And so we just run community events like CTO breakfasts, software dinners, and like you just build like a big network of close friends. And like when you launch, like people are like, hey, this might be a good company to talk to, or they refer you things. And it's like happens a bit more organic if you put the work in to build a software community. And so we just started doing that, and then everything got cancelled. Our meetups, our dinners, our breakfasts. And then we were meeting with like, I think Time Magazine, New York Times, like some big kind of brands, and they all canceled and moved all the meetings online. And so suddenly you're sitting in like the most expensive city in the world thinking, oh my God, like we're paying all this money to sit in our apartment and do work online. Like we could be in New Zealand. Like why, like, you know, you're not in New York to like sit in an apartment. You know?
No, true.
That was the driver, I think. And it was good. I think, look, in hindsight now, it's like, it's a bit of a nightmare over there.
And how's the rest of your team doing? I'm assuming you're checking in with them on a daily basis.
Yeah. So we, my last 3 companies, like most of our team has been in New Zealand. And so when we started this, even though my 2 co-founders are British, we decided that we just sort of found like after we sold our last company, we found like the quality of our engineering team in New Zealand was like, I would say, I'm obviously biased as well, but was way higher than the average quality of the engineers we were seeing in New York. Nice. And then the cost of hiring in New York was so expensive. Yeah. It was like 50 to 100% more. And then the employee churn was like really high. Like people would basically change jobs every 1 to 2 years, on average. That's not even like a bad scenario. Whereas I think our team that we'd worked with in New Zealand, we'd worked with most of them for like 5 years. So we sort of saw that, and then we decided that our money would go a lot further if we sort of kept it in New Zealand, and then we build more runway to build a really good product. And so we basically jumped on with a couple of friends I'd worked with at my last company as well. And we built out a team of about, I think 11 engineers in Wellington. And then we've got 3 of us in the US and 1 part-timer. So I think we're still heavily focused on building a New Zealand sort of heavy software company. Like that's where I think we're planning on hiring all our engineers except for sales and integration engineers or solutions engineers.
Nice. As Virginia has suggested, you need a Christchurch hub.
I know. Well, that's a shame, because the only reason why we've got it in Wellington is because after the earthquake and our office was destroyed, I moved to New York just to do sales, and I didn't even have a visa. So I was just flying in and out. And then my business partner, Cody, was from Christchurch. His girlfriend at the time, now wife, was living in Wellington. And so she was like, hey, you should come up to Wellington. And so after the earthquake, he moved to Wellington to basically be with her. And then we ended up building our software teams in Wellington. So that's like literally the only reason we ended up building teams in Wellington. And I think now starting a new company, you've had 10 years of teams there. You're sort of like, if I was to start another software company in Christchurch or Auckland, my personal situation is I just don't know. I don't know all those people. Like the only people I really know who are software engineers were in Wellington. So it sort of made it easy. But yeah, we'd probably love to. I mean, ideally, it'd be super cool to have a Christchurch office if we can build it into a successful company. But
well, we know some people you could talk to, Guy.
I know what it sounds like. I mean, Christchurch used to be like, I think when I came through university, it was always considered like the sort of hub of software engineers in New Zealand. And Rod Carr, obviously at Jade Software at the time, like he was like my first mentor. So I used to go and do my meetings in there, and their Playboy Mansion porno offices. If you guys have been into that place near the airport with the sort of black glass and like weird sort of angled, waterfalls with ferns in the main foyer with like red sort of velour carpet, that kind of thing. That was my early introduction to software, and obviously just that was enough. I was hooked.
Nice. That's great.
Yeah.
So for you, Guy, obviously the solution that you've come up with for the Student Volunteer Army, your Shopify system that you've got up and running, that's sort of taken a bit of your time over the last few weeks. You're still running things back with all the other business ventures that you've been working within the States, doing it all remotely and online meetings. You must be doing meetings late at night, early in the morning.
The worst is actually UK. Like we're talking to some UK clients and like just 3 a.m. is not like the best time.
Yeah.
But the US isn't too bad. I think it's just you sort of end up working at 6 a.m. to kind of midday is like really heavy meetings because there's your crossover time especially with the East Coast. But then it means your afternoons are quite like relaxed to actually sort of focus on getting work done. So I think I've kind of done it the other way a lot earlier in my career, whereas I was like the only remote worker and then our whole team was remote and distributed. So I've sort of used to it a lot, working from home. And I think early on, like after a year or two of working by yourself remotely, you sort of go a little bit crazy, but I'm now battle hardened to lockdown mode. So this is with a baby used to working remote with remote teams. Like I was like lockdowns, there's actually not much difference to my normal life, which is a bit sad. Oh, well.
Nice. Well, we want to thank you for the work that you put into developing this solution to help our elderly to actually get out there and get those vital supplies that they need. Really do appreciate you coming home and putting your hand up and saying, look, I'm keen to lend a hand. And that just speaks to your character, and we appreciate that.
Oh, thanks so much.
I'm sure there are loads of people in Christchurch that would be able to provide you with anything you need to get anything set up down here, or to assist you with the other things you've got going on.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, I think there's a big team. I'm just one part of it, and so we've got some really cool people that are helping Student Volunteer Army. It'll be interesting. It's one of those things where every week you're not sure if you're going to build something different, or whether, like, we started with 3 services. We found one wasn't really needed because we were offering childcare for healthcare professionals that are retired, and there hasn't been that swell yet in the hospitals, so like they haven't needed to go back to work yet. So we built like a whole technology solution around a problem that we thought was going to be massive and hasn't arisen. So it's just like classic startup stuff, but just on a faster timeline and with no money, which is probably the same as normal startup stuff, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, I think we're very fortunate in New Zealand, and the Prime Minister mentioned it last week when she was talking about where we were sitting on the curve, that off their initial projections, we were expecting to be at sort of 3,000-4,000 cases, and we're only just over 1,000 at that time. And it just goes to show that the approach that the New Zealand government took of going hard and going early has been beneficial for us as a society and as a nation. And I think probably, you're probably going to have issues getting back to New York anytime soon. I'd say the borders are going to be closed for at least the next 12 months, if not longer. But I think you're in the right place.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. And I think we're just going to go from strength to strength now that we're getting into level 3 and then back to level 2. And hopefully we can keep it out of New Zealand and just build a really solid society in our little island state. It's wonderful.
It's awesome.
Do we have any questions for Guy? We've got a couple of minutes, or for Helen? Brent?
No questions coming through for either of them.
Cool, but thank you both for sharing your stories. Really do appreciate it. And we're going to do another breakout session. We've got another 10 minutes left to a lot of time. So we're going to drop into breakout rooms again for a different group of people and have another little bit of networking.
Yeah, but before we do, let's give a bit of a shout out to Helen and Guy for joining us this evening. Thanks very much. I've unmuted you all.
Yeah, great stuff, guys.
Thank you.
Nice, and that was great, Guy.
And now, if you'll just bear with me a moment, I'm going to chuck you into some slightly larger groups. And then we'll come back in a few minutes.
Sounds good. Thank you, Neil. Sure. All right, I've unmuted myself, Neil.
Oh, there he is. Yeah, couldn't find you.
Well, there we go. That's pretty much us for the night, I think, isn't it, Neil?
Yeah, I figured we'll just do one more round of breakouts and then people can bail out whenever they choose to. So I'll leave you to
Cool.
wrap up, Andy.
All right. Well, so we'll do one final little chat of moving around the room, the virtual room. But hey, thank you so much for joining us for this session this evening. Thanks to Guy and Helen for sharing some of their stories and their backgrounds. Look, we're doing another meeting in a couple of weeks' time. We'll obviously all still be in our lockdown in level 3. So hope you can all join us for that. And you will see that we'll be doing another feedback poll after this event. Neil, do you want to share the feedback from the last poll?
No, I've lost it. But we'll circulate
We'll
it
do it
tomorrow.
next week.
Yeah.
We'll do it next week. In a fortnight, I should say, at our next meeting. But hey, look, if you need to sign off now, that's all good. But we'll go to one last breakout socialized session. And we look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks. Thanks for your time this Tuesday evening.
I'm going to make for slightly bigger groups and let it run a bit longer. Just bail out when you're done and we'll close down when in about 10 minutes. Have a good evening.
Good to see you. Oh, hi, Helen. You again.
Some of us have come back.
Oh, Paul is here. I hadn't seen you, Paul.
Hi, Andy. How are you, mate?
Yay.
Oh, I just got to meet Brad, another of our recruiter brethren.
Oh, right. Yes, I've met Brad. Yeah,
A few
yeah,
familiar
absolutely.
faces.
Yeah,
We just put a
thanks
good
for-
word in for you, Paul.
Oh, that's nice. Well, thanks for emceeing it, Andy. It's been awesome.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah,
It ran a little bit more smoothly tonight than it did last time, didn't it, Neil?
Oh, it's good. Yeah,
It
yeah.
did. I'm getting the hang of the button pushing.
Yeah,
slowly.
yeah.
It was a good job, though. No, the breakouts went well.
Oh, hey,
Yeah, I
yeah.
think
Yeah.
so.
Good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Surprisingly so, I think. The first time I joined one, I thought, oh, God, this is going to be awful. But surprising, it works all right.
Oh, look. There's everyone in there. I've just put a grid view on.
Yeah, I'm just
Gallery
saying.
view should be the default.
Oh, no, I'm going to make this spotlighted.
It's really good.
So, Andy, time to wrap.
Hey, look, thanks everyone for coming along, keeping us company this Tuesday evening. So we're not all sitting here by ourselves with Neil, me and Brent chatting to ourselves with no purpose. Although that's not a bad thing to do as well.
We can do that another time.
You can always do that.
Look forward to
Yeah,
next.
check
Thanks,
back
all.
in. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time for the next
thanks,
plus
guys.
meeting. Sorry about this hole in my head. Obviously, too much reflective light there. And,
Bit like Helen's teeth.
yeah,
I was going to
stay
say, I
safe,
thought my
stay home,
teeth was
and
as bad.
enjoy whatever takeaways you're treating yourself to on Tuesday.
Yay!
Look like I'm saying-
Thanks
Yeah,
for joining.
thanks, guys. Really
Find
good.
something to make it different.
Bye.
Yeah. All the best.
Take care.
Bye.
Nice meeting you guys. All right. Thanks for hosting, Andy and Neil.
Cheers.
Yes.